Ahora vamos con Amie MacDonald, ecosistemas costeros y cuáles son los retos y oportunidades de trabajar en este tipo de ecosistemas enfocados a aves playeras. Entonces, Amie pues maneja un poco de español, pero también decidió grabar su presentación y ponerle subtítulos. Entonces, así es como le vamos a hacer.
Hi everyone, I'm Amie. I'm with Birds Canada, where I'm the Motus coordinator for British Columbia. First, I want to say thank you to Julian for organizing this workshop. I'm really excited about it. And I apologize that my presentation isn't live, but I will be here for the question and answer period, so please feel free to ask me any questions that you might have. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about using Motus in coastal ecosystems. So coastal ecosystems are often good environments for Motus arrays. They are relatively open and flat in many cases, and this means you have a pretty good chance of getting a decent number of tag detections. This is a map of the Motus wildlife tracking system in August 2014, and what I wanted to point out is that a lot of the Motus stations, the yellow dots, were in coastal areas along the east coast of Canada and the northeast United States, as well as some in James Bay and along the Hudson Bay coasts. So a lot of early Motus development happened in coastal environments. There's also been demonstrated success using Motus in coastal ecosystems. I thought I'd highlight just a couple of shorebird studies that have used Motus and relied on coastal arrays. So this is from a study done by Ali Anderson and colleagues that looked at migration strategies of various shorebird species departing James Bay on southbound migration. And they found that migration strategy depended on the body condition of the bird and the migration distance of the species. So this is an example of a continental or even hemispheric scale Motus study, since they relied on detections between James Bay and the east coast of Canada and the United States, and even all the way down into South America. But Motus has been used on a more local or regional scale as well in coastal environments. And this is from a study done by Sarah Naima and colleagues in the Bay of Fundy in Atlantic Canada, and they looked at local and regional movements of semi-palmated sandpipers in the Bay of Fundy. And what they found was that semi-palmated sandpipers made a lot of local movements within a region of the Bay of Fundy, but they didn't often move between regions. So that's just a couple examples of how Motus has been used in coastal environments. And now I'll move on to selecting a site for a Motus station and some tips for installing Motus stations. So even though Motus can work quite well in coastal environments, you still want to choose your location carefully and think critically so that you maximize your probability of getting detections. So one thing that's really important is to having a clear line of sight in the direction that the antennas are pointing, if at all possible. This is an image from Google Earth, and the green shows the field of view from a location where we set up a Motus station in British Columbia. So we pointed our antennas to the north, northwest, and northeast over the tidal flats so that we would have antennas pointing where there was a good field of view. If you can get your antennas up high, this can be good so that you can clear any vegetation or small buildings that might obstruct tag signals. If you know of high use areas that birds are frequently at, those can be good spots to put Motus stations. And if you have antennas pointed so that they follow the coastline, that can also work well in some cases because birds will often move along those coastlines. You also want to think broadly about where other stations are or where other stations are planned for the future so that you can have a strategically designed array and maximize your coverage of the area. Of course, all of this depends on where there's space and you have the ability and the permission to put up a Motus station. Some tips for installing Motus stations that I have picked up along the way over the last while is that if you can build on existing infrastructure, these stations tend to be sturdier and require less maintenance in the long term than the pop-up freestanding towers. Of course, it's often harder to get the permissions to install these Motus stations that build on existing infrastructure. So plan more time than you think you might need to get the approvals in place. In coastal locations, this infrastructure might look like park viewing platforms or lighthouses where antennas and sometimes a mast and antennas can be attached to railings. And a bonus of lighthouses is that they're often quite high. Of course, building installations aren't always possible, especially in more remote areas. So certainly there are lots of occasions where you do need to put up standalone or freestanding towers. And some things I've learned about putting these up, sometimes the hard way, is that if you can use stainless steel or galvanized steel for the guy wires, that's those wires extending out from the tower that secure the tower. If you can use galvanized or stainless steel for those, that's good because they last longer in marine environments. The salt and the moisture don't corrode them as much. In terms of housing the receiver, the battery, and solar controller, I have mostly used these sturdy weather-resistant plastic tote containers that have lids that clamp on. And one thing you can do is you can put on a PVC pipe elbow pointing downwards for the coaxial cables to come in to the housing. And this helps keep water from getting into the receiver. And another thing you can do to minimize your chances of getting water in the receiver is to elevate the receiver a couple feet above the ground if you can. So in the picture here, we built a little stand for the receiver box just out of a few pieces of wood that got the box a couple feet above the marsh so that if there was an extremely high tide or a storm surge, the receiver wouldn't get flooded. If it's at all possible, finding a location that has a power supply that you can just plug the receiver into can be super helpful. Plugging into standard electric supply is generally more reliable than solar, and it's less expensive at setup because you don't have to buy a solar panel and a battery. Of course, this can be quite hard to find a location that has a power supply you can use, but if it's possible, it can be super helpful. Collaboration is the fundamental principle behind Motus. Because tagged animals are detectable on stations maintained by others and not just on the stations that you maintain, we're all working together to support each other's projects. So collaboration is crucial to success. Finding partners who have a location and an interest in hosting a Motus station can help you get a great station when you have the materials on hand, but not necessarily the space or the land to put it on. So an example of a successful collaboration that we've had fairly recently was we installed a Motus station on a pump station operated by a city here in British Columbia that does water management. So the city was open to hosting the Motus station on the pump station when we approached them about it. And so we got a sturdy Motus station with power supply near the tidal flats. And we'll share the data of what birds get detected on the station with the city so that they can use that information in some of their biodiversity programs. On to the challenges. Coastal locations can get quite windy, and sometimes your Motus station is unfortunately in the path of a hurricane, and that's just bad luck, and there's not a lot you can do about it. But this is these are a couple stations that did get hit by a hurricane, and fortunately we had brought the receiver in from the one on the left the day before since we were worried about the hurricane, and so we lost a couple days of data, but the receiver didn't get flooded out in the storm. In high winds, especially if a guy wire snaps, sometimes the mast will just bend right over. And there are a couple potential solutions that you can use to try and prevent this from happening. If you're using a telescoping mast that extends in sections, you can extend those sections only part way so that there's overlap, a good amount of overlap, and that will reinforce the mast. Or you can attach some of these metal angles to the mast to help reinforce it. And these bent over stations can look not great, but with a replaced mast, a lot of the other parts are all still intact and they can be up and running again fairly quickly. In terms of tracking shorebirds, many of the projects that have used Motus with shorebirds have glued nanotags to skin or feather stubble on the bird's lower back. And these don't stay on forever because they're attached with glue. So in many cases, they do fall off after a couple to a few months. But there are examples of birds keeping glued tags on for 6 months or more. Some red knots and semi-palmated sandpipers tagged on northbound migration have then been detected on the following southbound migration as well. But this certainly isn't the case for all of them. The key thing to think about is when are the birds molting? Because if you tag a bird just before it molts, when it molts is when it's most likely to lose that tag. So you want to aim for not too long after the bird has molted and hopefully avoid right before it's going to molt. Sometimes having the tag fall off after a while is a good thing, though, because if you're using just a battery tag and that battery has run out and the tag's no longer transmitting, you don't want the bird to be having to carry around that extra weight. However, if you're using longer lasting tags like life tags, you may want to consider using a harness, but I think you do need to be pretty careful using harnesses with shorebirds because many shorebirds do change their mass so dramatically over the annual cycle. They'll pack on a lot of fat quickly at a stopover site before a long migratory flight, and then they'll burn that fat and lose that mass quite quickly during migration. So, for example, the Rufa subspecies of the red knot, they can double their weight in as little as 2 weeks during stopover at Delaware Bay on northbound migration. So you want to make sure that the harness won't become too tight and hurt the bird if they gain mass quite quickly. And you also want to make sure that if they lose mass, that the harness won't become too loose and risk getting tangled. It's also good to think carefully about the non-breeding ecology and the migration ecology of a study species. So many shorebirds congregate in large numbers at stopover sites. So if you can get a Motus station at a stopover site, you have a good chance of getting a good number of detections. And that's a really great thing about tracking shorebirds. However, some species, like some phalaropes, do spend a lot of time on the open ocean during the non-breeding season, so there's little opportunity to detect them if they're in areas where it's very difficult to install a Motus station. So you just want to think carefully about what time of year you're going to be able to track these birds and factor that into your study design. I'll finish up with a few ideas on finding collaborators. Parks and nature conservancies or trusts they often have an interest in conservation science, so they may be open to hosting a Motus station. You might be able to install a Motus station on a viewing platform like this one at a wetland in Ontario. Municipalities sometimes have infrastructure that they may be willing to work with you to host a Motus station on, but the permitting and approvals process can take some time for that, so just make sure to factor it in. Permissions can be more straightforward with private landowners if you find someone who has an interest in participating in Motus. And one really neat collaboration, I think, is that some schools in Canada have Motus stations on their roofs. So that has the additional benefit of providing an opportunity for students to learn about birds and migration and conservation and have a direct connection to those birds that are detected on the Motus station at their school. So sometimes it's just a matter of talking to a lot of people and finding out who's interested in birds and hosting a Motus station, and finding a way to make it a beneficial collaboration for both groups and getting a great Motus station out of it. With that, I'll say thanks so much for coming, joining the workshop today, and thanks again to Julian for organizing. Please let me know if you have any questions during the question and answer period, and also feel free to contact me at any time at the email address on the slide, and I'd be happy to help however I can. Thanks.
Muy bien. Bueno, muchas gracias, Amie. Ahora sí que iniciamos nuestro viaje en Canadá. Ya escuchamos su opinión sobre cómo es instalar estaciones Motus en ecosistemas costeros. Escuchamos sobre Erin contándonos cómo ellos instalan sus estaciones en Estados Unidos, pero la realidad es un poquito diferente cuando cruzas la frontera de Estados Unidos a México. Y Erin está trabajando y empezando a trabajar para poner estaciones también en el desierto chihuahuense, no solamente en los pastizales. Entonces, aquí vamos a empezar a ver estos nuevos retos que se presentan una vez que empiezas a trabajar en Latinoamérica, y luego Nick y Ana nos contarán ahora sí de los verdaderos retos latinoamericanos. Erin, puedes compartir tu pantalla cuando quieras.
Ok, ahora voy a hablar sobre un proyecto que estamos avanzando. Es un proyecto de Motus en las pastizales de las grandes llanuras del norte y el desierto chihuahuense. Y otra vez es un proyecto colaborativo. Yo, Matt y Mo Carell estamos buscando los fondos, organizando talleres, webinars, platicando con colaboradores en todos los pastizales de Canadá, Estados Unidos y México. Pero voy a hablar un poco más de lo que vamos a hacer en México. Otra vez, mi nombre es Erin Strasser y trabajo con Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, y somos una organización sin fines de lucro y trabajamos en la conservación de aves y sus hábitats. Usamos la ciencia, el manejo sostenible y la educación para avanzar nuestra misión. Pues las especies de aves que dependen en los pastizales están un grupo de aves que están declinando más rápidamente que los otros grupos en Norteamérica. Y esas especies de aves de pastizales están anidando en las grandes llanuras del norte, que están en áreas del estado de Montana, y en Canadá, en Alberta, Saskatchewan. Y esas especies de aves se migran hasta el desierto chihuahuense, hasta unos pastizales que la mayoría son en México, pero también están en Texas, Arizona, Nuevo México. Y hay muchas áreas de interés con las aves de pastizal. Tenemos varias preguntas sobre sus demográficos, sus tasas demográficos durante la época de anidación, durante el invierno, pero más que todos tenemos muchas preguntas sobre el parte entre la época de reproducción y invierno. Y tampoco no tenemos mucha información sobre sus movimientos durante invierno. Y por qué el desierto chihuahuense es un área con muchas amenazas, mucho cambio climático, muchas áreas que están completamente destruidos, que ya están agricultura. Entonces estamos trabajando en ese proyecto para formar una colaborativa de Motus por todos los pastizales, y voy a hablar sobre específicamente lo que vamos a hacer en México. Los pastizales en Norteamérica se representan por el área rosa acá, y todos los puntitos negros son las estaciones de Motus que existe ahora. Y podemos ver que casi no existe estaciones en los pastizales, y por eso estamos avanzando en este proyecto. Los objetivos de nuestro proyecto de Motus en el desierto chihuahuense es investigar preguntas clave para conservar las aves de los pastizales. Esas son especies como el Anthospragii o el Centroinex verdi, que pasan a veces 8 meses en el área de invernación. Queremos construir y fortalecer alianzas en la región. Tenemos varios colaboradores y estamos en comunicación con otros. Tenemos fondos del U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Treaty Act, y con nuestros colaboradores de la UHED y UANL vamos a construir 8 estaciones en el desierto chihuahuense. Estamos solicitando más fondos para construir otras estaciones, pero básicamente nuestro plan es poner varias estaciones en los pastizales abiertos donde viven las aves de pastizales durante el invierno. El plan es muy similar a lo que está haciendo Julián. Vamos a comunicar y trabajar con varias organizaciones para construir las estaciones y mantenerlos. También tenemos fondos de NFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, y con esos fondos vamos a construir por lo menos 30 estaciones en el parte de Estados Unidos y Canadá. Y estamos solicitando más fondos para poner estaciones por todos los pastizales. ¿Y cómo vamos a lograr eso? Como ya mencioné, es un proyecto colaborativo y hay varios grupos que están trabajando en el desierto chihuahuense. Pronatura Noreste, IMC Vida Silvestre, OVIS, Fondo Mexicano para la Conservación de la Naturaleza y mucho más. Entonces, ahora y hasta pues, el año que sigue y tal vez 22, quién sabe, vamos a comunicar con varios grupos, buscar fuentes de fondos. Bird Conservancy, tenemos fondos para construir estaciones, pero buscamos colaboradores para mantenerlos. Vamos a ofrecer varios talleres para revisar el equipo, para construir estaciones, revisar cómo podemos usar los datos, cómo bajamos datos, y también talleres de capturas de aves de pastizal. En los proyectos en los que he trabajado, formamos grupos de voluntarios, estudiantes, biólogos, para visitar los sitios donde estamos capturando aves, para que ellos pueden tener la oportunidad de aprender más de las aves. También a veces tenemos grupos de como estudiantes de las escuelas secundarias para ayudar con las capturas y aprender más sobre la ecología de esas aves de pastizal, la importancia de las pastizales en el desierto chihuahuense y también la tecnología que usamos. Entonces, queremos ofrecer muchos talleres y oportunidades con la gente que vive allá. Esta parte, pues, es difícil decir cuándo podemos hacerlo debido a la coronavirus. Entonces, el plan es tener los talleres en 2021 y 22, pero vamos a ver qué va a pasar. Y durante todo este tiempo vamos a establecer las estaciones y también capturar y marcar las aves de pastizal con los transmisores. Y estamos haciendo más o menos lo mismo en las partes de Estados Unidos y Canadá. Ya hemos organizado un webinar con colaboradores y personas de interés de Canadá, Estados Unidos y México. Y vamos a ofrecer otro más en noviembre para discutir más sobre fuentes de fondos y también identificar las ubicaciones optimales para construir estaciones. Los talleres, pues hay mucho para aprender en webinars así, pero es muy importante tener oportunidades de poner sus manos en el equipo, aprender todas las partes, tocar las partes, aprender cómo mantener una estación y buscar los problemas, troubleshooting, y aprender qué no hacer. Entonces el plan es formar unos talleres en México cuando podamos. Y también los talleres de capturas de aves de pastizal. Hay mucho para aprender sobre la captura y comportamiento de estas especies. Y son aves muy delicadas que se mueven mucho. Y hay muchas cosas para aprender y queremos compartir esa aventura con todos de nuestros colegas. Una cosa de interés de Bird Conservancy es también colaborar con los investigadores que están estudiando las aves acuáticas o de humedales. En el desierto chihuahuense hay áreas de lagunas, uno que se llama Laguna Santiaguillo, por ejemplo, que están en el medio del desierto y son áreas de importancia para las aves acuáticas. Y también es un área de importancia para especies como el Anthospraghi, que es una especie que se migran desde las grandes llanuras del norte. Entonces, tenemos ganas de colaborar en buscar fondos para construir estaciones en áreas que pueden dar beneficios a investigaciones de aves de pastizal y también de aves acuáticas. Y como ya mencioné, todo ese trabajo es trinacional. Estamos haciendo esfuerzos de colaborar con nuestros socios en los Estados Unidos y Canadá para poner estaciones en todos los pastizales. Si tienen ganas de participar en nuestro proyecto de Motus en los pastizales, voy a compartir esa información en el chat, pero pedimos unos KMLs de un polígono de un área de donde trabajan en los pastizales, para que podamos guardarlos y estimar identificar las áreas de importancia, las áreas de donde existen los recursos, las personas para mantenerlos o guardarlos. Entonces voy a compartir toda esa información, pero si quieren colaborar, podrían mandar un correo con el KML o shapefile a Erin Youngberg, el otro Erin, acá está su correo electrónico. Y en nuestro siguiente webinar sobre Motus en los pastizales, vamos a poner todos los shapefiles, todos los KMLs para identificar las áreas de importancia. Perdón, se me olvidó incluir la fecha de nuestro siguiente webinar, pero es en noviembre, creo que es el 17 o creo que es el 17 de noviembre, pero voy a compartir la información con todos de ustedes. Otra vez, si tienen preguntas o quieren colaborar, favor de contactarme o Matt Webb, y espero que podamos conectar en los pastizales o en algún área de México para platicar más sobre eso. Gracias.
En el siguiente módulo, Motus en bosques neotropicales, impartido por Ana González y Nick Bailey.